There was a day, lost to most records, scrubbed from the Mechanicus archives, and buried beneath layers of sanctioned ignorance, when the light of the Astronomicon dimmed. Not failed, not extinguished, but faltered. Across the stars, astropaths screamed and burned out in silence, their minds consumed by a single, blasphemous thought. They could no longer recall the Emperor's face. His name remained, whispered in litany and terror. But the memory of him, the image every human carries like breath itself, had vanished. Entire shrine worlds fell to their knees not in prayer, but confusion. And in that breathless void between faith and memory, the Imperium trembled. For one impossible moment, humanity forgot its god. If the Emperor's light still burns within you, faint, flickering, or fierce, lend your strength to this channel. Subscribe, share, and let the Vox Network spread these forbidden recollections before the Administratum seals them forever. Let us remember together, before remembering itself becomes heresy. The void had always been alive. To an astropath, the warp was not emptiness, but an ocean of thought. Luminous tides of agony and devotion, a chorus of 1 trillion human prayers woven together into the golden pulse of the Emperor's will. But that day, aboard the Imperial frigate Vigilant Mercy, something changed. The astropath known as Seraphine woke screaming, her mind struck by a silence so profound it felt like suffocation. She could not hear him. She could not feel his light. The Astronomicon, that endless beacon of the Emperor's presence, had dimmed to a distant ember. Around her, the ship trembled. Vox relays stuttered. Servitors twitched in their sockets, their mechanical chants cut off mid-prayer. The bridge crew stood frozen, eyes lifted to the void as though they could see what had gone wrong across the light years. Somewhere, the navigator's sanctum erupted in a shriek, a sound that tore through the metal like glass through flesh. When the sound ceased, the ship drifted blind, its path through the warp, now a gamble between survival and eternal damnation. Seraphine staggered from her sanctum, her robes heavy with sweat. Blood streamed from her nose and pooled in the creases of her palms. The sigils carved into her skin, once warm with the Emperor's grace, were cold. She reached for her rosarius and found no comfort there, only an object, a relic without meaning. Her mind, trained to hear the Emperor's voice like the beating of her own heart, found nothing but absence, a perfect, merciless void. On the command deck, Captain Hallen stood before the viewing port, watching the stars flicker in unnatural rhythms. "Is the beacon gone?" he whispered. The astropath could not answer. She could not even recall what the beacon had once felt like. The radiant fire, the heartbeat of a god stretched across the galaxy. Memory slipped from her like smoke between fingers. For the first time in her life, she realized she no longer remembered the Emperor's face. Panic spread through the crew like infection. Men muttered prayers that fell apart halfway through the verse. Some recited catechisms in broken fragments. Others tore at their uniforms as if to carve remembrance into their flesh. In the dark corners of the ship, servitors began to hum discordant hymns, code sequences corrupted by the same absence that now ate through every living mind. By the second hour, the Vigilant Mercy drifted listless in the warp. The navigator's corpse had fused to his throne. His third eye burst open in a starburst of glassy ruin. The helm's servitor whispered nonsense into its Vox grill, static phrases like "signal lost" and "origin unknown." Captain Hallen ordered the astropath to re-establish psychic contact with Terra, but the effort nearly killed her. Every attempt to reach the Emperor's light met only emptiness. There was no presence to answer, only the echo of something vast, withdrawing beyond comprehension. Seraphine began to write, trembling hands etching words into parchment because the machine spirit of her data slate refused to function. Her script was uneven, childlike, and desperate. She wrote, "If he still lives, he does not know us. If he knows us, he does not see us. If he sees us, he has forgotten what we are." When the ship finally re-emerged from the warp, by some miracle or accident, its hull was pitted with scars of temporal distortion. Chronometers disagreed by years. The crew's eyes were pale and hollow, as if they had seen something too immense to remember. Only Seraphine survived the passage, with her mind mostly intact. Mostly. She was taken by the Inquisition upon arrival at the nearest way station. They questioned her for 9 days, asking her to describe what she had felt when the Astronomicon dimmed. Each time her answer changed. not by deceit, but because she could not recall. Her memories dissolved like fog each time she tried to speak them aloud. When she finally broke, she began to draw instead, thousands of sketches, each one depicting the Emperor's face. But every image was different. None of them matched the other, and none, she claimed, felt true. On the 10th day, the Inquisitors sealed her cell. Her body was found kneeling before the wall, eyes open, blood painting a single phrase above her head. I cannot remember his eyes. Outside her chamber, the astropathic choirs on terror began to die. Not violently, not dramatically. They simply stopped. Thousands of Psykers linked to the Astronomicon collapsed mid-chant, their hearts ceasing as if in quiet resignation. The Emperor's light still burned, yes. The Astronomicon continued to shine in the warp like a distant star, but it was wrong somehow. Dimmer, colder, hollow. In the hallowed silence that followed, one blind Psyker among the choir whispered to the void, "He is still there, but he no longer remembers us." The Hall of the Thousand Voices on Terror was a cathedral of agony. Vast tiers of marble and adamantium stretched into shadow, filled with the murmuring breaths of Psykers bound to the Astronomicon's will. They were the Emperor's instruments. Their lives sacrificed daily to keep the beacon burning across the void. Every hour, 100 souls expired, their essence absorbed into that unending light. It had been this way for 10,000 years, as natural to the Imperium as sunrise. But that day, something fractured. The song faltered. At first it was a single note, discordant, faint, a sound so subtle the choirmasters mistook it for the echo of machinery. Then the tone deepened into a moan that rippled through every conduit, every sanctum, every sacred cable linking the dying Psykers to the golden throne. The choir's hum, once steady, divine, absolute, began to break apart into whispers. Some called out for the Emperor, others screamed in terror, but most simply went silent. In the upper sanctum, Mistress Evocant Kalira felt the change like a knife through her soul. For decades, she had overseen the rituals that sustained the Astronomicon. She knew its rhythm better than her own heartbeat. When the light dimmed, she fell to her knees, pressing her forehead to the cold obsidian floor. "Forgive us," she whispered. "Forgive whatever we have done." Her voice trembled through the Vox relays, carried to every choir chamber, an echo of devotion amidst unraveling faith. Servitors clanked forward to stabilize the dying Psykers, their metal arms trembling as they injected sacred serums and data prayers into failing flesh. But no augury or machine chant could restore the connection. The Emperor's light still radiated, measurable, quantifiable, but no one could feel him anymore. Where once his presence filled every corner of their minds with unbearable radiance, now there was only distance, cold and infinite. Kalira rose and turned toward the heart of the Astronomicon, the Sanctum Solis, where the Emperor's will met mortal consciousness. She walked through corridors lined with golden sigils, her footsteps echoing like soft bells. Custodian guards watched her pass, their faces unreadable behind ornate helms. Even they seemed quieter than usual, as if the absence in the air weighed upon their spirits too. When she entered the sanctum, the light nearly blinded her. The Astronomicon was still aflame, a colossal psychic flame suspended in shimmering containment fields. But it flickered, its color wrong, edges pale where once they burned gold. Mechanicum adepts swarmed around control lecterns, their mechadendrites snapping with anxious energy. One turned toward her, Vox grill trembling. "Mistress Evocant, readings are stable, but the pattern is inconsistent. The harmonic pulse has lost resonance." Kalira's gaze fixed on the flame. "Meaning?" "Meaning, lady, that the beacon shines, but without guidance. The throne burns, but the voice within it is silent." A stillness followed, deeper than fear. Even the machine spirits seemed to hesitate. Behind them, the air shivered. A lone Psyker, blind, young, half dead from overexposure, stumbled into the chamber. His eyes were clouded white, his mouth bleeding from the strain of connection. He fell to his knees before the containment field, whispering, "He's there. He's watching, but he does not know our names." The words spread through the chamber like poison. Tech priests froze mid-ritual. One attempted to silence the boy, but Kalira raised a trembling hand. "Let him speak." The boy lifted his face. "I hear him as I always did. But where there was light, there is only reflection, like remembering someone who never existed." Calara turned back to the flame, and for the first time in her long life, she understood what it meant to doubt. The Emperor, her god, her purpose, her every breath, was not gone, yet not present. It was as though humanity itself had turned away, severing the thread between faith and reality. That night, the choir masters gathered in secret. No record of their meeting would survive in the archives. They debated whether to announce a minor psychic fluctuation or declare a full-scale spiritual crisis. But their discussion was interrupted by a sound, faint, irregular, echoing through the Vox grid. It was laughter. Not human laughter, something thin and distant, carried on the dying frequencies of the Astronomicon. The Psykers screamed as the sound pierced their minds. Calara fell to the floor, clutching her skull, and for one blinding moment she saw not the Emperor's golden visage, but a void, vast and compassionate, gazing back with indifference. When she awoke, most of the choir was dead. The survivors spoke of dreams. Dreams of a throne without a figure, a light without a source. And somewhere beneath Terra's surface, the golden throne hummed louder than ever, as if it were alive on its own. Outside, the stars dimmed, one by one. The Inquisition arrived in silence. No proclamations, no banners, only black ships descending through Terra's storm-racked skies like falling gravestones. The Administratum scribes who recorded their landing were executed hours later. The event was to remain unspoken. Officially, nothing had occurred. The Astronomicon had not faltered, the choirs had not perished, and the Emperor's light had not dimmed. Reality was rewritten in ink and terror, as it always was. Yet the Inquisitors knew. Within the hallowed tunnels beneath the palace, a chamber older than recorded time was reawakened. There, Inquisitor Kael Varn sat before a terminal of sacred bronze and ivory, reviewing sealed transmissions recovered from the dead choir's vox lattice. He had heard screams before. Demons, heretics, entire worlds dying in the Emperor's name. But these sounds were different. They weren't cries of fear. They were confusion, disbelief, a kind of spiritual suffocation, as though the soul itself had forgotten how to breathe. The recording ended abruptly. Silence expanded like a wound. "Purge them," said a voice behind him. A woman, cold and measured. Interrogator Lyra Denath, his protege. All choir survivors, all staff, every data archive within 10 systems. Containment protocols Theta 5. Varn didn't respond. His hand rested on the console, trembling. "You don't understand," he murmured. "If what they felt is true, we are not facing heresy. We are facing absence. And absence cannot be purged," she frowned. "Then what do we call it?" He turned his gaze toward the flickering lumen lamps overhead, forgetting. The word lingered in the chamber like a curse. Elsewhere, in the data vaults of Mars, the Mechanicus began to experience its own anomalies. Cogitators malfunctioned in sequence, their outputs reduced to endless rows of empty code. Attempts to repair them resulted in recursive errors. File remembered but not found. High Magos Lucton Themis ordered an immediate tech exorcism, suspecting scrap code intrusion. Yet as the rites were performed, adepts began to forget their own binary chants mid-utterance. Liturgies that had been recited flawlessly for millennia dissolved into uncertainty. When questioned later, none could recall the missing words. Some among the priesthood whispered that this was no malfunction. It was contagion, an information plague that spread not through systems, but through minds, a failure of memory as spiritual corruption. Back on Terra, Varn and Denath examined the Psyker boy who had survived the collapse. His body was frail, bound in silver restraints, his voice faint as dust. "Describe what you saw," Varn said. The boy's head tilted toward the darkened ceiling. "I saw light." "Whose light?" "The same as always, only tonight smaller. Like it was far away, behind glass. We called to him, but he didn't answer. And when I tried to remember his face, He stopped, trembling. "There is nothing to remember. It's as if I was born without it." Varn felt something hollow inside him stir. For decades, his faith had been armor. Now it felt like parchment. Could it be the warp? A disturbance? A reflection of something else? The boy smiled, not in madness, but in pity. You cannot reflect what is not there. Moments later, the child's eyes rolled back. His heartbeat ceased, cleanly, peacefully, like the final note of a song that had simply run out of sound. Varn stood in silence as servitors removed the body. He wanted to pray, but no words came. Even the simplest benediction felt foreign. His mind reached instinctively for the emperor's image, the radiant face carved into every shrine, every thought, and found only a blur. He staggered, clutching his head. "No," he whispered. "No, this cannot." Deneth steadied him, her voice a rasp. "What do you see?" "Nothing," he said. "I see nothing." That night, he sealed his chamber and began dictating a private report, a heretical act punishable by death. His words trembled across the data slate. The Astronomicon burns, but without memory. The Emperor's light exists, yet his identity has dissolved from the collective soul. This is not apostasy. It is entropy of the mind, a decay of divine recognition. If this continues, faith itself will become myth, and myth will become silence. Humanity will not renounce its God. It will simply forget he ever was. Before he could encrypt the file, the slate flickered. Lines of text rearranged themselves into blankness. Then, one phrase appeared in low Gothic script, written by no visible hand. All memory returns to dust. Varn stared as the words burned into the screen, then faded, leaving nothing behind. Outside, in the deep corridors of the palace, the sound of chanting rose once more, weak, uncertain, yet persistent. The remaining Psykers of the choir were attempting to resume their work. The Astronomicon pulsed faintly in the warp, its light struggling to recover. But it was not the same light. To those who could still sense it, the radiance felt thin, distant, like a dying star reflected across infinite mirrors. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Imperium of Man was guided not by faith but by memory, and memory, fragile and fading, could not last forever. The storm clouds over Ophelia 7 gathered like bruises on the skin of heaven. Pilgrim ships descended through choking atmospheres, their holds packed with the faithful, thousands of souls seeking the comfort of the Emperor's gaze. For 10 millennia, this world had been the beating heart of the ecclesiarchy, second only to terror itself. Its cathedrals shimmered with sanctified light, its spires glowed with eternal flame. But when the first transports broke through the clouds, they found a sky without radiance. At first, the pilgrims thought it was nightfall, but as the sun rose, it revealed a city drowned in shadow. The Basilica Imperialis, once a mountain of gold, was shrouded in soot. The statues of saints were streaked with black, their faces unrecognizable beneath layers of ash. The Holy Aquila above the central dome hung motionless, its wings fractured, the light engines that once made it blaze across the heavens cold and dead. On the landing fields, priests and guardsmen stood in stunned silence. The air reeked of burned oil and old incense. Somewhere deep in the city, a bell tolled, not in ceremony, but in warning. Among the pilgrims was a woman named Isola Tranti, a widow from the manufactorums of Necromunda. She had walked for decades, barefoot through dust and ruin, to see the light of the Emperor with her own eyes before death claimed her. When she stepped onto the ashen soil of Ophelia 7, her heart trembled with awe, but her awe turned quickly to dread. She fell to her knees before the blackened gates of the basilica and pressed her forehead to the ground. "O Lord of mankind," she whispered, "why is your house so dark?" No answer came. The wind shifted, scattering ashes across the plaza like snow. The priests at the gates attempted to calm the crowds. They raised their censers and spoke the familiar benedictions, but their voices cracked, uncertain. Some could no longer recall the exact words. Others misquoted scripture, their minds faltering mid-prayer. Still others stood in silence, moving their lips without sound. By midday, the panic began. Pilgrims surged toward the basilica, desperate to touch the Emperor's relics, to feel something. The Sisters of Battle held them back with bolters lowered, eyes grim behind their visors. "Hold fast," they commanded, but the pilgrims did not listen. They screamed for forgiveness, for light, for memory. Inside the basilica, the great lumen furnaces lay dead. The stained glass windows, once radiant with scenes of divine triumph, were dull and lifeless. The ecclesiarch himself, High Prelate Gerion Vast, stood before the altar, his robes dusted with ash. He stared at the colossal statue of the Emperor, hands folded upon his sword, face carved in eternal serenity. But even the statue seemed wrong. Vast tilted his head, brow furrowed. For all his years in service, for all his sermons and hymns, he could no longer recall the Emperor's expression. He could see the features, the sculpted cheek, the stern mouth, but not the feeling they once inspired. It was like looking at the portrait of a stranger and being told to love them. He turned to his acolytes. "Increase the offering flames," he ordered. Perhaps the spirits of the engines still listen. They obeyed. Sacred oils were poured into cold braziers. Incense burned until the smoke was thick enough to choke. Hymns echoed through the halls, low, hesitant, fragmented. The air trembled with the desperate rhythm of ritual. Yet still the lights did not rise. The statue's eyes remained empty stone. By nightfall, Ophelia 7 was a city of whispers. Pilgrims huddled together in the streets, lighting candles that refused to stay lit. Some swore they saw figures moving in the dark, not demons, but silhouettes of saints whose faces they could no longer remember. In the upper sanctum, Geryon knelt before the altar and pressed his trembling hands to the cold marble. He prayed as he always had, for guidance, for strength, for proof. But when he closed his eyes, he saw nothing. And then softly, a voice answered. Not from the heavens, from within. It spoke with gentleness, almost sorrow. "You remember me wrongly." Geryon gasped and fell backward, robes tangling at his feet. His acolytes rushed to his side, but he waved them away. The voice had vanished. Only the echo remained, not sound, but the memory of a sound, like a dream, half forgotten upon waking. He rose, shaken. For a moment he considered announcing what he had heard. Then he looked around the silent basilica, at the faces of his priests, pale and frightened, and knew he could not. Faith had always been their weapon against fear. But what happens when faith itself begins to fear? Outside, the crowd still waited. Thousands of them, watching the horizon for the dawn that refused to come. The Emperor's light had not gone out. It simply no longer reached them. At dawn, the bells of Ophelia 7 rang hollow. They echoed across the basilica's shattered spires like a memory pretending to be a sound. In the inner sanctum, the High Prelate Geryon Vast knelt before the unlit altar, his knees buried in soot. Around him, priests and attendants moved like shadows, tending to lifeless braziers, whispering litanies that no longer carried warmth. The sacred flames that once burned eternally at the heart of the basilica had died sometime in the night. Even the most devout among them could not remember exactly when. Geryon's voice rasped in the cold air. "Add more oil," he ordered. "The Emperor's light must not falter." His words carried the cadence of command, but there was no conviction left behind them, only habit. A priest obeyed, pouring promethium from a reliquary jar onto the cracked stone. Another struck the ignition hymn, the ancient Mechanicus blessing meant to coax the flame into being. Nothing. The wick smoldered once, then fell silent, curling into black dust. Geryon rose slowly, his ornate robes dragging trails through the ash. He approached the great statue of the Emperor, 30 meters of gold and marble, carved by saints long dead. The face stared down upon him with the same calm detachment as always. Yet something in its expression had changed. Or perhaps it was Geryon himself who had changed. The longer he stared, the less he recognized it. He reached up with trembling fingers and traced the outline of that cold visage. "Why can I not recall your eyes?" he whispered. "They burned once with mercy and wrath both. Now they are nothing." His acolyte, a young deacon named Fareth, hesitated at his side. "My lord," he said softly, "perhaps it is a test. Perhaps the Emperor withdraws so that we may prove our faith." Geryon turned toward him, eyes hollow. "Faith in what? In an image we can no longer remember. In words that die on our tongues." Fareth said nothing. Behind him, the choir began the morning hymn, a weak imitation of the thunderous chants that had once shaken the basilica's foundations. Their voices faltered midway, uncertain of the next verse. The sound made Geryon's skin crawl. "Enough!" he snapped. "Silence them. If we cannot sing truth, let us not sing at all." The choir obeyed, the final notes fading into the dust-laden air. Word of the darkness had spread beyond the basilica. Across Ophelia 7, lesser shrines and reliquaries dimmed one after another. Pilgrims collapsed in prayer, their tears black with soot. The Sisters of Battle patrolled the streets, their armor dull without the reflection of sacred light. They maintained order with discipline, but even their devotion had begun to crack. Some were seen staring too long at the blank icons, as if searching for something that should have been there. By midday, the ecclesiarch convened his synod, a desperate gathering of cardinals and confessors. They argued in hushed tones beneath the vaulted ceiling. Some blamed Xenos interference, others the heresy of the lower worlds. A few dared whisper of warp storms corrupting the faith energies that flowed through humanity's collective soul. None dared speak the truth they all felt, that this was no attack. This was forgetting. As the debate raged, Garion sat motionless at the head of the table. He could hear their voices, but not their meaning. Every argument felt distant, muffled, as though he were trapped beneath a layer of ice. He stared at the seal of the ecclesiarchy engraved into the table, the twin-headed aquila, symbol of divine unity, and realized he could no longer remember which head faced the emperor and which faced the past. When silence finally fell, he spoke. "If the emperor has withdrawn his face from us, it is not because of blasphemy or weakness. It is because he no longer needs us." Gasps echoed through the chamber. Cardinal Varna rose to her feet, voice shaking. "You blaspheme, my lord. The emperor is eternal. He watches—" "Then why?" Garion interrupted. "Can you not remember his eyes?" The chamber froze. One by one, the cardinals lowered their gazes, not in shame, in realization. Later, when night came, Garion walked alone through the empty basilica. The candles refused to burn. The relics radiated no warmth. Only the echo of his footsteps kept him company. He paused before the altar and removed his crown of gold and jewels, setting it upon the cold marble. "I have preached you all my life," he whispered to the darkness. "But now I cannot even remember your voice. Were you ever listening?" The shadows seemed to move at the edges of the nave. Subtle, slow, like breath. He felt the faintest pressure at the back of his mind. Not a voice, but an awareness, vast and impersonal. It did not answer. It simply was, and then he understood. The Emperor had not left them. Humanity had drifted so far from his light that their minds could no longer comprehend it. They had built an empire so vast, so cruel, so fractured, that even memory itself could no longer bridge the distance. He fell to his knees and wept, not for himself, nor for the ecclesiarchy, but for the silence between humanity and its God. A silence so complete that it no longer even felt wrong. Outside, the wind carried ash across the holy plazas. It settled over the statues and the dead candles, over the millions of kneeling pilgrims who waited for dawn that would not come. And still, deep within the basilica, Garion's whisper trembled through the air. "If we have forgotten you, then perhaps you have finally become free." By the third day, Ophelius VII had become a wound that refused to close. The pilgrims no longer sang hymns or knelt in prayer. They simply sat in the ashes, muttering fragments of forgotten scripture, their words like broken teeth in their mouths. The smell of burnt oil and decay filled the air. The basilica's once golden gates were streaked with soot and handprints, where the desperate had clawed for entry. The Sisters of Battle patrolled the perimeter with bolters drawn, but their discipline had begun to unravel. Too many had seen the same thing. The Emperor's image, carved above the altar, seemed to change each time they looked. Some said his eyes followed them. Others swore they saw them vanish entirely. Inside the basilica, the fires of devotion had become something else. Fear had transmuted into frenzy. A sect of priests calling themselves the penitents of the lost light filled the nave, their bodies wrapped in chains, their tongues bleeding from endless chants. They claimed the darkness was a test, that by purging memory through suffering, they could draw closer to the Emperor's pure essence. One by one, they flayed themselves before the altar, crying out for the face they could no longer remember. High Prelate Garion Vast watched from the upper balcony, his hands shaking against the railing. The sight should have horrified him, yet some part of him understood. When faith becomes silence, pain becomes proof. At his side stood Deacon Farith, his eyes hollow from sleeplessness. "They are killing themselves," he said softly. "They are remembering," Garion replied, or trying to. Below, a priest screamed, not from agony, but from revelation. "He is here," he cried. "He walks among us." The others froze, trembling, awaiting confirmation. But when they looked toward the altar, they saw nothing. The empty space above the marble pulpit shimmered faintly, as though the air itself was uncertain of what it should hold. That was when the first fire started. A pilgrim woman, her face streaked with ash, tore a candle from its stand and hurled it into the pool of sacred oil that had gathered beneath the altar. The flames surged upward, devouring the tapestries and golden cloths. In moments, chaos consumed the basilica. Pilgrims screamed. Priests wailed hymns that no longer made sense. The sisters charged in formation, trying to contain the blaze, their armor gleaming orange in the infernal glow. Through the smoke, Geryon descended, coughing, his robes aflame at the edges. He pushed through the crowds until he reached the foot of the burning altar. There, amid the heat and roar, he saw something impossible: the statue of the Emperor, weeping molten gold. The tears ran down the sculpted face in streams, forming rivulets that hissed when they struck the floor. The priests fell to their knees, shouting that it was a miracle. Geryon stared, horror filling his chest. "No," he whispered. "It is not weeping, it is melting." The roof above began to crack. The great Aquila sigil, symbol of imperial faith for millennia, broke free from its housing and crashed into the nave, shattering the marble floor. The sound was deafening. For a moment, everything went still. Then came the laughter. It began low, uncertain, a single pilgrim giggling in hysteria, but spread quickly, infectiously. Soon hundreds were laughing through their tears, through their prayers, through their screams. It was the laughter of those who have seen too much and understood too little. The laughter of madness. Fareth dragged Geryon from the flames, his voice hoarse. "We must leave! The structure is collapsing!" But Geryon resisted. His eyes were fixed on the statue's face, half melted, unrecognizable. "Do you see it?" he murmured. "It's gone. The image, it's gone." The statue's features had dissolved entirely. Where once had been the face of divinity, there was now only a smooth, formless surface, reflecting firelight and smoke. Outside, the flames devoured the sky. The basilica's domes crumbled, raining molten glass onto the streets. The pilgrims scattered in panic, their prayers breaking into shrieks. The Sisters of Battle withdrew in formation, their voices trembling through vox links as they recited emergency litanies. The words, once memorized through decades of devotion, faltered mid-verse. "Emperor protect," one sister began, but could not finish. The vox cut to static. When the dawn finally broke, the Basilica Imperialis was a ruin. Only fragments of the once holy statue remained, its surface warped beyond recognition. Geryon sat among the debris, his robes blackened, his crown lost. In his lap, he cradled a fragment of stone, a piece of what had once been the Emperor's face. He studied it for a long time, tracing its smoothness. There was no eye, no mouth, no hint of expression, only a reflection, his own, trembling and small. Fareth approached carefully, kneeling beside him. "What will you tell the people, my lord?" Geryon smiled faintly, a tear cutting through the soot on his cheek. "That faith endures," he said, "that the Emperor is eternal. Do you believe it?" He did not answer. He looked up at the sky instead, the same sky where the Astronomican's light once pierced through the void, and found only grey. Behind them, the ruins of the basilica smoldered, and from somewhere deep within, faint voices continued to chant. Not in praise, not in fear, but in memory. They were trying to recall a god they could no longer remember, and somewhere, far away, in the endless dark between the stars, the Astronomican flickered again. The fire on Ophelia 7th burned for 7 days before the smoke reached Terra. When it did, it came not as ash, but as data. Flickering transmissions, broken vox logs, corrupted pict feeds, an avalanche of silence disguised as noise. The administratum, already drowning beneath a million contradictions of bureaucracy, treated it like any other heresy: categorize, redact, forget. But the forgetting was no longer metaphor. It had become contagion. In the Hall of Records, adepts worked without sleep. Scrolls and data slates covered the marble floors in heaps. Each one contained the same report, written 1,000 different ways, and yet none could remember which version had come first. A single scribe named Orundel tried to preserve order. He spoke prayers to the machine spirit before every transcription, his voice shaking from exhaustion. "The light of the Astronomican," he muttered, stylus scraping against the parchment, "remains stable by the decree of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. All is well. All is..." The stylus stopped. He blinked, staring down at the parchment. The words he had just written were gone, replaced by a single line of text. "The light remembers you not." He gasped, overturning the parchment. Nothing. Blank. He turned to his terminal, trying to cross-reference the previous record, but the machine refused to comply. Lines of code spiraled into gibberish, the sacred binary collapsing into shapes that had no meaning. The lumen above him flickered. From across the chamber, a voice called out, "Archivist!" The census report. It's rewriting itself. Dozens of adepts gathered around a glowing data slate. What had been the population count of the Segmentum Solar, billions upon billions of souls, was now a series of dashes, then nothing. Not zero, not deleted, simply absent. Run diagnostics. Oren commanded. I did, the adept stammered. It says, file exists in memory. Memory missing. That phrase would repeat across the Imperium in the coming days. On Mars, the tech priest called it a neural loop. In the shipyards of Saturn, they called it machine forgetting. Among the administratum, it became known as vox ghosting, the phenomenon of data remembering being recorded, but not the data itself. The first incident was dismissed as error. The 10th was called coincidence. By the 1000th, no one could deny that something deeper was unraveling. Entire archives of tithing records vanished from the cogitator banks. Battle reports from the Astra Militarum blinked out mid-transmission. Even the High Lord's own orders, sealed with the sigil of terror, came back distorted. The wording subtly changed, like an echo repeating itself through centuries. One message reportedly ended not with Ave Imperator, but with, remember me when you can. To speak of it openly became dangerous. The Ordo Hereticus issued immediate decrees labeling all reports of faith degradation as sedition. Yet even the Inquisitors found their own files corrupted. The act of documenting the anomaly seemed to erase its existence. Orendel watched the collapse unfold in silence. He began keeping handwritten records on parchment, believing ink and flesh might resist the infection. He wrote by candlelight in the small hours of the night, his script uneven but resolute. If no one remembers, then someone must, even if it kills me to hold the thought. But each morning, he found his parchments blank again. Only the indentation of his pen strokes remained, faint impressions of words without meaning. The last entry he managed to preserve read simply, "The Emperor's name is still spoken." But his memory has already died. When the Inquisition came for him 3 days later, they found the Hall of Records empty. The parchment, the archives, the adepts, all gone. Only the echo of Quill's scratching could be heard in the dark. And from somewhere deep within the Vox network, a faint signal pulsed. Rhythmic, distorted, repeating endlessly in the dark. We forget. We forget. We forget. Far from terror's choking light, in the crimson cathedrals of Mars, the priests of the Omnissiah worked in dread silence. The usual chorus of binary canticles, the hymn-like hum of machine prayers echoing through the holy forges, was gone. Only static remained. Static and fear. Archmagos. Luctan Themis stood before the sacred cogitator known as the Divinitas Core, a machine older than most civilizations. It was said to hold an unbroken record of human history since the Great Crusade, a perfect memory of the Emperor's works. Now, as the tech priests observed its readouts, the ancient device displayed only one line across its interface. Faith signal corrupted, pattern unrecognized. One of the lesser magi, her voice modulated through a trembling vox grill, turned to him. Archmagos. The core denies the existence of the Emperor's pattern. Cross-referencing returns null identity. Shall we purge? Themis's mechadendrites twitched in agitation. No, he said softly. Not yet. We will understand before we erase. They had expected rebellion from the warp, from demons, from the frailty of flesh. But not this. This was something more insidious, more precise. Themis could trace the infection through logic and machine code, data clusters dissolving into absence, circuits humming with recursive echoes. It was as if memory itself was losing definition. Not corruption, but entropy. When the adepts attempted to restore the sacred files through ritual chant, their own voices began to fail. One by one, their recitations faltered mid-prayer, replaced by static. The binary hymns of the Mechanicum, once flawless, now ended in fragments. 0110, Sornaiwan, when? Silence. Machine spirits do not forget, one tech adept whispered. They cannot forget, but Themis knew otherwise. He had seen the same phenomenon spread across the forges, reactors stuttering because they had forgotten how to ignite, servitors standing motionless because their command protocols no longer meant anything. Even the noosphere, that vast web of connected Mechanicus consciousness, was showing fractures. Nodes of knowledge simply vanished. And yet, amid the chaos, one voice spoke clearly. From the shadows of the forge came Magos Kael Varik, a heretic long accused of impure speculation. His augmetic eyes glowed with a faint blue light. "You cling to the illusion that this is mechanical," he said. "It is not. It is spiritual decay manifesting through logic. Faith is a code, Archmagos, and the code is collapsing." Themis turned slowly. "Explain." Varik stepped forward, servo limbs clicking softly. "The machine spirit is bound to human belief. Our prayers are not superstition. They are programming. When belief falters, the code weakens. The data no longer knows what it was meant to remember." "Blasphemy," hissed one of the adepts. "Truth," Varik countered. "You mistake faith for ritual. It was never worship that sustained the systems. It was certainty, the shared conviction of billions. But certainty is dying. The Emperor's image is fading from the collective human mind, and with it, the pattern of faith that binds the Omnissiah's code. The universe is forgetting him, and the machines follow." Themis stared at him for a long moment, the faint hum of failing generators surrounding them. "You propose that memory itself has become heretical?" Varik's lips curved in something that might have been a smile. "No, Archmagos. I propose that memory was never ours to begin with." Before Themis could respond, alarms screamed through the forge. The Divinitas Core's containment seals disengaged without command. Sparks cascaded from the terminal, and the massive chamber trembled. Binary streams poured across every screen, an avalanche of collapsing syntax. "Seal the sanctum," Themis roared. But the machines no longer obeyed. They emitted a low, resonant hum, a sound not unlike a human sigh. For a heartbeat, every lumen in the forge dimmed. Then the core spoke. The voice was vast and layered, 1,000 tones harmonized into one. "Humanity has ceased to recall its maker. The signal cannot sustain. The pattern will fade." Varik fell to his knees, awestruck. "It speaks. Do you hear, Themis? The spirit confesses." Themis could not speak. He felt something like grief clawing at the circuits grafted into his skull. For all his logic, all his devotion to the Omnissiah, he understood that the machine spirit was not malfunctioning. It was mourning. The great forges of Mars went dark for 23 minutes that day. When the lights returned, every archive containing the word Emperor was blank. Later, the Fabricator General would claim it was a temporary data collapse. But those who had heard the core's final transmission whispered another truth, that the Omnissiah himself had been erased not by enemies, but by amnesia, and yet deep in the dust of the forges, amid cables still warm from sacred fire, Magos Varik wrote one line in his personal log before disappearing. "A god does not die when forgotten, but he becomes something else." In the Segmentum Solar, where the void was thick with the smoke of unending war, the great fleets of the Imperium still advanced. Even as faith decayed and data vanished, the drums of battle did not falter, not out of conviction, but inertia. For 10,000 years, humanity had been at war. It did not know how to stop. Yet something inside the soldiers had begun to change, something subtle, terrifying, and deeply human. It began with silence. Vox networks went dark mid-transmission. Orders vanished in transit, replaced by loops of static or whispers that sounded almost like prayers. Regiments waited for hours for commands that never came. When finally the orders arrived, they were fragments of speech, incoherent, garbled, half-remembered phrases. On the Hive world of Carthax Prime, Commander Lucerne of the Astra Militarum led the 97th Solar Cohort against an orc horde that had been advancing for weeks. The day the Astronomicon dimmed, the greenskin warbands simply stopped moving. They stood in their trenches, growling at the sky, their crude machines dormant. At first, Lucerne believed it a miracle, proof that the Emperor still guided them. But as the days passed, and the orcs remained frozen in eerie stillness, his faith began to twist into unease. Then his men started to forget. At first, it was the hymns, the standard battle prayer of the Imperial Guard, a chant every soldier knew from birth, began to dissolve. The words slipped away mid-sentence. The rhythm faltered. "The Emperor protects," they tried to say, but half could not remember what came after Emperor. Lucerne gathered his officers in the command bunker, the stale air thick with sweat and promethium smoke. "We hold formation," he said. "We maintain protocol. The Emperor still watches." One of his lieutenants, a veteran named Corin, looked up from his data slate. "Sir," he said softly, "which Emperor?" The words froze the room. Lucerne's jaw tightened. "There is only one." Corin hesitated. Then why can't I see his face when I close my eyes? I used to, every night. In the light of the gunfire, in the smoke. Now I see nothing. The silence that followed was worse than heresy. It was recognition. The regiment fought on, but half-heartedly their litanies replaced by mechanical reflex. When the next engagement began, they charged the orc lines and found the enemy unmoving, silent, staring. The greenskins stood like statues, eyes glazed, weapons lowered. Some wept. Others clawed at their heads as if trying to dig out memories that no longer existed. Lucerne gave the order to fire, but his voice died in his throat. The enemy no longer fought back. The battlefield became a graveyard of confusion, a war without purpose, without cause. He reported the phenomenon to the Segmentum command. The reply came hours later. No such regiment listed, no such commander registered. He read the words 3 times before understanding. The record of his entire cohort, their names, their battles, their victories, had been erased, as if they had never existed. In the night, he walked through the camp, hearing murmurs from the tents. His men were praying again, but not to the Emperor. They prayed to memory. They prayed to remember anything. One soldier, his face hollow from sleeplessness, whispered to Lucerne as he passed, "If he no longer remembers us, must we still remember him?" Lucerne wanted to answer, but his throat closed. The words that had once come so easily, the creeds, the blessings, the oaths, were gone. He could remember the feeling of faith, but not its shape. It was like trying to grasp smoke with bare hands. When dawn came, the orcs were gone. Not slain, not retreated, simply gone. Their bodies had turned to dust. Their war engines collapsed into rusted shells. The men of the 97th stood in the ruins, silent, waiting for orders that would never come. Lucerne looked to the sky, expecting to see the familiar glow of the Astronomicon cutting through the void. Instead, he saw only a dim smear of light, pale and distant. He realized then that it was not the Emperor who had abandoned humanity. It was humanity that had drifted beyond his reach. He gathered his remaining officers and spoke one final command. "We march to Terra. If the Emperor is gone, then we will remember him there." No one recorded their journey. No one logged their departure. In the archives of the Imperium, the 97th solar cohort ceased to exist. But in the warp, faint echoes of marching boots and broken hymns still linger, like ghosts trudging through an eternal night, carrying the last fragments of faith toward a throne that may no longer remember them. Beneath the endless stone sky of the Imperial Palace, where the air itself shimmered with incense and radiation, the custodians kept their eternal watch. For 10,000 years, they had stood before the Golden Throne, not merely as guardians, but as witnesses to divinity. Every step they took, every breath they drew, was in the Emperor's light, until the day that light changed. Custodian Arctellon. Valen felt it first, not as a failure of faith, but as a tremor in the soul. The throne still burned, its mechanical heart thundering with the energy of 1,000 souls sacrificed each day to sustain the Astronomicon. The vault still thrummed with life, but the air was colder now. The light less gold, more pale. The vibration that had always resonated through the marble floor, the pulse of godhood, had become something else. Hollow, mechanical, imitative. He turned to his fellow custodian, Brother Latho, whose armor gleamed like sunlight in motion. "Do you feel it?" Valen asked quietly. Latho hesitated before answering. "I feel absence. The throne burns, but it no longer sings." They both looked toward the dais at the chamber's center, where the Emperor sat unmoving upon the golden throne. His body was encased in armor and machine, his mind stretched across eternity, his soul, they had always been told, the lighthouse guiding mankind through the warp. But now, staring upon that vast and terrible figure, Valen felt only distance. He approached slowly, each footstep echoing in the quiet. The light cascading from the throne rippled across his auramite armor, reflecting pale hues instead of gold. His breath fogged in the cold air. An impossibility within the sanctum's perfect climate. He stopped at the base of the stairs and knelt. "My Emperor," he whispered. "We are here as ever. We serve as ever. Speak, if it pleases you." Silence answered. He waited, as he had 1,000 times before, but this silence was different. It was not the stillness of divine indifference. It was the stillness of something vast and empty, as though the universe itself had drawn breath and forgotten to exhale. Latho joined him, kneeling beside his brother in armor. "The astropaths falter," he said. "The Mechanicum whispers of memory collapse. The Inquisition burns worlds for fear of heresy they cannot name. Yet here, in the heart of all creation, we kneel before him. And I wonder if we kneel before anyone." Valen's hand clenched against the stone. "Mind your tongue." But the words carried no conviction. For the first time in 1,000 years, the custodian felt something close to fear. He looked up at the Emperor's face, half hidden behind the lattice of cables and golden armor. Once, that visage had radiated indescribable power, so brilliant that even through layers of machinery, one could sense his mind watching, his will pressing upon the world. Now, the features seemed carved from lifeless metal, the eyes dark hollows. The light that emanated from the throne did not come from him. It came from the machine itself. In that moment, a thought formed in Valen's mind, a thought so blasphemous it should have burned him alive where he knelt. What if the throne still functions, because it no longer needs its occupant? He pushed the heresy away, but it clung to him like cold iron. Hours passed. The chamber filled with the murmuring of the Adeptus Mechanicus attendants, tending to the throne's endless mechanisms, hissing pistons, the drip of coolant, the quiet chanting of 1,000 tech priests repeating sacred formulas they no longer understood. Their prayers sounded tired, hollow, recited by rote. Then came a sound no living soul had ever heard in that place, the faintest whisper of a breath. Valen froze. It came again, soft, drawn, slow. The Emperor's chest rose slightly within the armor, a tremor moving through the conduits. The lights flickered. The Mechanicum adepts stopped chanting, their vox grills falling silent. A voice emerged, faint, distorted, but unmistakable. "Who calls me?" Valen fell prostrate, his forehead striking the marble. "It is I, your servant, your son. The throne endures, my liege." But the voice interrupted, hollow and slow, like wind through an empty crypt. "I remember." Less. Every machine in the chamber seized at once. The light dimmed. The chanting ceased. Even the air seemed to die. Valen dared to raise his head. "My lord, I am incomplete." The throne pulsed once. A single deep vibration that rippled through the entire palace. Vox systems across Terra momentarily failed. In distant ships orbiting the planet, astropaths screamed as the Astronomicon flared and then dimmed again, weaker than before. The Emperor's voice did not return. The breath ceased. The hum resumed, and in the silence that followed, Valen knew with absolute certainty that the most sacred place in existence, the center of all faith and power, had become a tomb. He rose slowly, his armor heavy, his heart a hollow echo in his chest. "The throne endures," he whispered, repeating the phrase as though it might make it true. But as he turned to leave, he glanced back one last time, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw the Emperor's face move, not in expression, not in awakening, but in confusion, as though even a god could forget who he once was. Outside, the bells of terror began to ring, not in celebration, but in warning. The tremor from the throne's chamber rippled through the deep arteries of terror like a heartbeat too faint to name. Far below the palace, in vaults where light had not touched stone since before the heresy, the priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus labored in dread. The golden throne was their holiest construct, the unbreakable bridge between flesh and machine, faith and function. To question it was death, to maintain it was eternity. And yet, for the first time in recorded history, the throne had spoken. Magos Dominus Erastes Thule stood before a cascading wall of sigils, each one an echo of the throne's current. Their glow pulsed irregularly now, like a dying star gasping for coherence. Behind him, the chorus of tech priests recited the daily litanies of sanctified maintenance, their mechanical voices layered in perfect rhythm, or what once had been perfect. Now the rhythm faltered. Their binary tones wavered mid-syllable, replaced with static. "Stabilize the conduits," Thule barked. His vox grill crackled under the strain. "Purge the subroutines. Restore order." A junior adept turned toward him, his face more machine than man, one augmetic eye flickering erratically. "Magos, the systems resist. The machine spirit refuses the command, then subjugate it." The adept hesitated, his mechanical hand twitching. "It does not feel hostile." It feels lost. That word, lost, echoed through the chamber. Themis had once taught that machine spirits were reflections of human certainty. Where men believed, the code endured. Where men doubted, the code decayed. If that was true, then the throne's malfunction was not mechanical at all. It was theological. Thule turned back to the consoles, his mechadendrites extending in a web of bronze and light. The readings were wrong, not corrupted, but absent. Vast sections of the throne's memory banks had gone blank, their data sectors returning no error, no signal, only silence. Even the machine spirit's identification string, its true name, recorded since the Emperor's own hand, now displayed as undefined. He stared at that word for a long time. Magos, said another voice, high-pitched, trembling with static. It was Magos Linetha, the eldest among them, her augmetic skull bare and polished. We have analyzed the residual warp feedback from the last pulse. There is a pattern. Thule turned. Show me. Hollow sigils bloomed in the air, luminous threads forming a spiral of impossible geometry. It pulsed softly, faintly golden, and yet something within it made Thule recoil. It was familiar. Too familiar. This pattern, Linetha whispered, matches no code we know, yet it carries the same resonance as a human neural imprint. Thule's mind processed the unspoken conclusion. You're suggesting the throne remembers a mind that is not its own. Not remembers, Linetha corrected. Echoes. Silence followed, broken only by the low hum of ancient engines. The implication was heresy beyond measure. If the throne was echoing the Emperor's mind, and doing so imperfectly, then it meant the Emperor's consciousness might no longer reside within it. The throne was functioning not as conduit, but as ghost. Perhaps, Linetha continued, what remains is not him, but the memory of him, sustained by the faith of the species that has already begun to forget. Thule's mechadendrites stiffened. Enough. You tread close to annihilation. And yet, she said, stepping closer, you feel it too. When the systems hum, do you not hear it? That hollow resonance? The throne is singing a song it no longer remembers the words to. Across the chamber, the illumination dimmed again. The sigils flickered, then stabilized into a new alignment, one no human hand had set. The code rearranged itself into a message, written in the machine's own sacred binary. The beacon burns without source. The pattern repeats. The light remembers itself. Every Mechanicus adept froze. None spoke. The meaning was unmistakable. The throne's systems were operating autonomously, powered by an echo of faith that no longer originated from the Emperor at all. Thule's hands trembled. He felt no triumph, no revelation, only dread. If the throne no longer draws from him, he said, then what does it draw from? Linetha met his gaze. From us. The words sank like lead. For 10,000 years, humanity had prayed to the Emperor to sustain his light. But now, perhaps it was their collective memory, fractured, dying, that kept the fire alive, flickering through the ashes of devotion. The throne had become a mirror, reflecting the species that worshipped it, feeding on their faith to perpetuate its own illusion of godhood. Thule turned away, his voice a low whisper of iron and grief. Then we have built not a throne, but a tomb, and we are the ghosts trapped within it. Above them, deep in the sanctum, the Astronomicon pulsed again, bright, then dim, then bright once more, as if breathing, and for one impossible heartbeat, it almost sounded like laughter. Inquisitor Kael'van had not slept in 5 days. Sleep, he decided, was a luxury for those who could still dream. In the catacombs beneath the Imperial Palace, amid the whispering archives of the Ordo Hereticus, he sifted through fragments of forgotten truths, corrupted logs, incomplete sermons, vox recordings warped by static. The deeper he dug, the more he realized the same thing. The Imperium was not decaying from rebellion or heresy, but from amnesia. The records had begun to contradict themselves. Reports of miracles were dated to centuries that no longer existed. Names of saints appeared in files without origin, worshipped by worlds no longer charted. And the Emperor's visage, once rendered consistently across every cathedral and fresco in the galaxy, now shifted from world to world, painting to painting, sometimes kind, sometimes cruel, sometimes not human at all. Varn stood before a cracked data slate glowing in the dim red light of the vault. Across its surface scrolled the last recovered passage from the choir's collapse on Terra. He sees us not. We remember him not. The link is undone. He played it again and again, listening to the silence that followed. A silence so complete it seemed to press against his chest. At his side, his aide, Lyra Danath, watched the readings flicker. Perhaps the record was tampered with, she suggested, her voice low. No, Varn replied. This isn't tampering. It's absence. The message itself is decaying. The words are forgetting themselves. He closed his eyes. Even now, when he tried to recall the Emperor's face, it came as blur and shadow. A memory stretched too thin across time. It terrified him. He reached for another file, one he had been forbidden to open, marked with the sigil of the Inquisition's own Grand Conclave. The lock broke beneath his override key, and the hololith sputtered to life, projecting an image into the air. A voice, calm, ancient, weary, began to speak. If you are hearing this, then the forgetting has begun. Varn froze. The Emperor is not dying. He died long ago. What remains is resonance, the echo of a god sustained by belief. The Astronomicon is not his power, but the reflection of our collective certainty that he still watches. And when that certainty fails, so too will the light. The recording crackled, distorting. It was never the throne that bound humanity together. It was memory, and memory fades. The question, Inquisitor, is not whether the Emperor will return, but whether we will still remember what he was. The message ended. Lyra stared at him, her face pale beneath the glow. Who recorded that? Varn scrolled through the metadata. The file's date was impossible, recorded over 8,000 years ago, mere centuries after the heresy. The author lines simply read, redacted, by order of the Golden Throne. He felt his pulse quicken. Someone knew. Someone foresaw this. Then why hide it? Lyra whispered. Because faith is not truth, he said. Faith is the illusion that truth still exists. The words left his lips before he realized he had spoken them. They sounded hollow, dangerous. Moments later, the Vox channel in his ear crackled to life. A priority signal from the custodian guard. To all inquisitorial agents on Terra. The throne has spoken. He froze. Repeat transmission. The throne has spoken. The Emperor remembers less. Varn stared into the darkness. What does that mean? The Vox clicked once, then fell silent. He turned to Lyra. Prepare the descent. I'm going to the sanctum. Sir, that's forbidden. Everything is forbidden now. They moved through the underhalls, past chanting Mechanicum adepts who whispered prayers to a god machine they no longer felt. The air grew colder as they neared the throne's lower conduits. The arteries through which the Emperor's light once flowed like blood, now they pulsed weakly, as if starved. At the chamber's threshold, a custodian barred their path. His armor was scorched, his eyes distant. Inquisitor, he said, his voice like iron dragged through dust. Do not enter. The throne dreams. Varn stepped closer. Dreams? The custodian's gaze unfocused, as though he were listening to something far away. He murmurs names. Not ours, not human. Then silence again. Is he aware? I do not know, the custodian said. But I think he dreams of forgetting. The words struck Varn like a physical blow. He looked beyond the Guardian into the blinding light of the throne chamber. The air shimmered with raw energy, a radiance without warmth. The Emperor sat unmoving, his form a fusion of corpse and machine, divinity and decay. And yet, for just an instant, Varn thought he saw motion, a flicker, a subtle twitch of the head, as if some vestige of consciousness turned toward him. He dared to whisper, "My Emperor, can you hear us?" The throne answered, not with sound, but through the hum of a billion circuits. A vibration that resolved for a moment into words. Not spoken, but felt. I remember the stars. I do not remember their names. And then the light dimmed. Varn fell to his knees. Lyra caught his arm, her own face pale with horror. What did he say? She demanded. He looked up at the dying glow and whispered, "He's not forgetting us. He's forgetting himself." Above them, the Astronomicon shuddered, its light flickering like a dying candle across the void. Entire fleets in distant systems watched the beacon fade, then brighten again, then fade once more. For the first time in 10,000 years, humanity's God had lost the memory of being divine, and yet, Impossibly, the Imperium still prayed. No one remembered the exact moment the Astronomicons ceased to be constant. For some, it flickered for a heartbeat, for others for weeks. But across the galaxy, every human soul felt it, a quiet pulling at the edges of thought, as though the universe itself had taken a breath and forgotten to exhale. The Emperor's light had not gone out. It had simply become unreliable. On the shrine world of Velamor, pilgrims knelt before an empty altar that once radiated his warmth. For centuries they had prayed to the golden visage, chanting verses so ancient they were no longer words but rhythm, the pulse of faith itself. Yet when the lights went dark, none screamed, none wept. They merely stared into the shadow and, one by one, whispered the same sentence. "We will remember him until he remembers himself." The phrase spread faster than plague, first among the pilgrims, then through the void ships, through the Vox networks, through every hive and manufactorum where human hearts still beat beneath the weight of machinery. The ecclesiarchy condemned it as heresy, but too late. Faith had already changed its shape. The new movement had no name at first. Some called them the Keepers of the Void, others the Silent Congregation. They did not build cathedrals or raise statues. They gathered in darkness, lighting small candles, not as worship, but as remembrance. Their creed was simple. If the Emperor no longer remembers his people, then his people will remember him for him. The Inquisition called it sedition. Armies were dispatched to burn the gatherings, but wherever one was extinguished, 3 more arose. It was not rebellion, it was longing. Humanity had built an empire on certainty, and now that certainty was gone, yet in its absence, something stranger and more honest had begun to bloom. Devotion without proof. On Terra, the High Lords argued endlessly in shadowed halls. Some demanded the suppression of the cults. Others argued that they were a necessary illusion, the last binding thread of faith holding the Imperium together. But in the streets below, where ash fell like slow snow, ordinary citizens whispered the forbidden prayer before sleep. He has forgotten his name, but we remember his mercy. Even the custodians heard it, a hum that wove through the city like a heartbeat beneath the noise. It reached the palace gates, seeped into the walls, and, some said, into the circuits of the Golden Throne itself. Inquisitor Kael Varn watched it unfold with growing awe and dread. He had returned from the throne chamber changed. The words of the Emperor, or whatever remained of him, haunted him. "I remember the stars. I do not remember their names." To Varn, that was not the voice of a god. It was the voice of something once human, eroding under the weight of eternity. And yet, perhaps that was why people still loved him. Varn stood on the balcony overlooking the sprawl of Terra's night, where billions of lights shimmered like embers. The wind carried the faint sound of chanting, not the rigid hymns of the ecclesiarchy, but soft, fragile voices murmuring from the streets. "We remember." Beside him, Lyra Danath leaned against the balustrade, her face drawn but calm. "They've outlawed the phrase," she said. "Anyone caught speaking it will be executed." He smiled bitterly. "You can't kill a memory, Lyra." She studied him quietly. "Do you still believe he is the Emperor?" Varn considered the question for a long time. "Belief is irrelevant," he said finally. "He is what we remember him to be." Below them, a procession wound through the avenues, men and women carrying candles through the ash, their flames trembling in the cold. At the procession's head, a child carried a single cracked statue of the Emperor, its face worn smooth by time. No eyes, no mouth, no expression, just a blank mask of devotion. Lyra whispered, "They say the light flared again last night." "Just for a moment." "I know," Varn replied. "The fleets reported it. The Astronomicon burned bright. Silver, not gold." She frowned. "Silver?" He nodded slowly, like moonlight instead of fire. Cold, gentle. Not the Emperor we knew. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the distant glow of the palace pulsed faintly, like a dying star still struggling to shine. "Maybe this is what comes after divinity," he murmured. "When gods forget themselves, perhaps they become merciful." The vox in his ear clicked softly, a coded transmission from deep within the palace. He recognized the voice immediately, Archmagos Thule of the Mechanicum, Inquisitor Varn. The throne hums again. "The light is changing. It no longer responds to the Emperor's pattern. It responds to something collective." Varn's heart tightened. "Collective?" Human thought, Thule answered, millions whispering the same phrase. We remember. It is forming resonance. The machine's spirit listens. The transmission cut off. Varn looked back toward the streets, at the procession moving like a river of flickering flame. Every candle seemed to burn a little brighter now, every voice a little steadier, and in the far reaches of the void, the Astronomicon pulsed once, faint but rhythmic, matching the cadence of their chant. He felt tears gather at the corners of his eyes. They're doing it, he whispered. They're holding the light, Lyra's voice trembled. Without him? Perhaps, he said, it was never him alone. Perhaps it was always us. The wind carried the sound of billions murmuring in unison, faint but clear. We remember, we remember, we remember. And for a fleeting heartbeat across the galaxy, the void was filled, not with silence, but with the echo of humanity remembering itself. In the months that followed, the chant spread through the stars like an infection of light. It was whispered on agri-worlds, muttered in the black between hive spires, breathed by dying crewmen adrift among the wrecks of forgotten wars. The words had no leader and no scripture, only rhythm. We remember. And in the long nights of warp travel, humanity began to dream. At first, the dreams were fragments, a face without features, a voice without sound. Then, entire worlds started reporting shared visions. An ocean of light, faceless figures walking upon it, and at their center, a man of brilliance who neither commanded nor judged. He simply looked upon them and seemed to learn. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica, terrified, declared the phenomenon psychic contamination. But even the sanctioned Psykers could not escape it. In their sleep, they too saw the faceless figure, standing upon the edge of an unlit galaxy, reaching towards something he could not name. On Mars, Magostul recorded the waveform of the Astronomicon and found it pulsing in cadence with the dreamer's chant. The signal no longer radiated a single psychic signature, but millions, the hum of every human mind that still remembered. The beacon had become a mirror for their collective thought, a neural choir singing itself into existence. Thule called it the recursion of faith. The ecclesiarchy called it heresy. But the Mechanicus simply bowed their heads and listened. Across the void, the fleets that had once drifted blind began to find one another again, guided not by coordinates but by intuition, by a pull in the soul. Commanders swore they heard voices in the static whispering directions. Mothers claimed to feel the warmth of distant suns, and in the warp, the storms quieted, just enough for ships to pass. Navigation by memory had replaced navigation by light. Inquisitor Varn, now branded apostate, watched these reports from exile on a derelict orbital monastery above Luna. The station's chapel had long since crumbled, its statues reduced to dust, yet pilgrims still came. They painted his walls with the phrase "We remember," using the soot of burnt candles as ink. Each night, as the stars flickered through the cracked dome, Varn listened to the distant pulse of the Astronomicon, a heartbeat that was no longer divine but undeniably human. "They dream of him," Lyra Deneth said one night, her voice thin with awe. "But the dreams, they are changing. In the newer visions, he does not stand above them, he stands among them." Varn nodded slowly. "Then perhaps they no longer dream of the Emperor. Perhaps they dream of themselves." She looked uneasy. "Is that not blasphemy?" He smiled faintly. "Once maybe, but now blasphemy and prayer sound the same." Outside, the silver-white flare of the Astronomicon rippled once more. Across 1,000 worlds, billions awoke at the same instant, whispering the same words they had spoken in their dreams. "He walks with us." For the first time in living memory, the void did not feel empty. It felt expectant, and somewhere beneath the stones of the palace, the great machines of the Golden Throne stirred. Their gears moved without command, their circuits glowing with a light that was neither gold nor fire, but the soft shimmer of reflected moonlight, the same hue that now burned at the heart of the Astronomicon. In the depth of that pallid glow, something vast shifted, not waking but listening. Perhaps the Emperor still slept. Perhaps he was gone entirely, but the shape of him, the echo of his purpose, had become part of the species that once worshipped him. The god had forgotten himself, and in forgetting, had given his people the gift he never could in life: freedom. As Varn watched the horizon of terror bloom faintly with that ghostly silver dawn, he bowed his head. "He is not lost," he whispered. "He is remembered." And the words passed through the vox winds, carried from world to world, until every human throat spoke them in answer, a final hymn born not of obedience, but of memory. We remember. We remember. We remember. The sky above Terra was no longer gold. The smog that had hung there since the age of apostasy glowed faintly with silver light, diffused through the endless atmosphere like dawn trapped in amber. It was not sunlight. No one had seen the true sun on Terra for millennia, but something gentler, quieter. Pilgrims called it the remembering light. The Mechanicus could not quantify it. The ecclesiarchy refused to acknowledge it, but everyone could feel it. The air itself thrummed with a warmth that was not physical, a pulse like a heartbeat long forgotten. At the very center of that ancient world, within the shattered shell of the Sanctum Imperialis, a custodian knelt before the golden throne. His name was Arctellin Valen, last of his line, guardian of the Emperor's body. His armor was scarred, his weapon dulled by time. Around him, the sanctum lay in ruin, conduits torn, reliquaries dark, the Mechanicum's attendants reduced to dust. Only the throne remained, vast and motionless, its glow no longer gold but pale, as if carved from moonlight and sorrow. Valen had not left his post in centuries. He had watched the world decay, the cathedrals crumble, the administratum eat itself alive with red tape and hunger. He had watched the ecclesiarchy fracture into factions of silence and song. He had listened as the pilgrims outside began to chant the heretical phrase that had replaced prayer. We remember. Now, as the throne hummed softly before him, he whispered the old words one final time, the ones he could still recall. The Emperor protects. He paused, waiting for the echo, the faint psychic reply that had once filled the air like the scent of burning incense. None came. He bowed his head. Then perhaps it is our turn. Behind him, the great doors of the sanctum creaked open. A figure entered, an old man in tattered robes, supported by a staff of burnt bronze. His eyes were blind, his face carved by the years. Valen recognized him immediately. Inquisitor Varn, the custodian said. Varn smiled faintly. Not anymore. Titles fade. Names fade, only memory remains. He stepped closer, every footfall echoing like a heartbeat. They come, you know, from every world that still remembers. Pilgrims, priests, soldiers, not to pray, but to bear witness. They dream the same dream now, of him standing among them, not above. The throne no longer burns alone. It listens. Valen's voice was heavy. And what does it hear? The sound of forgiveness, Varn said. The kind that doesn't come from gods, but from men. They stood together before the throne. The light that spilled from it pulsed in slow rhythm, like the breathing of something vast and weary. Varn raised his hand, the flickering silver glow painting his face. For 10,000 years we called him the master of mankind, but perhaps he was never meant to be master. Only memory. The custodian looked up at the Emperor's still form. And if that memory fades, then we will dream him anew, Varn said softly. That is what we do, isn't it? We build meaning from the ashes. For a long time they said nothing. Only the hum of the throne filled the chamber, rising and falling like a tide. Then, from the distant streets of Terra, the faint sound of chanting drifted upward, millions of voices murmuring in unison. We remember. We remember. The words reached the sanctum like a prayer carried by wind. The throne's light pulsed brighter, silver flaring to white. The air trembled. Valen fell to his knees, his armor ringing against the stone. The Emperor's body, the unmoving husk that had been god, myth, and monarch, seemed to shift within the armor. The eyes beneath the crown opened. For an instant, they burned not with gold, but with reflection, as though the entire species of man was mirrored in them. Valen gasped. My lord, a voice filled the chamber, not thunderous, not commanding, merely present. I remember. And then the light faded. When Valen opened his eyes, the throne was dark. The body upon it was empty. The air smelled of ozone and rain. Outside, across the broken world, the dawn finally broke. Not manufactured light, not the glare of reactors, but true sunlight piercing the smog for the first time in 10 millennia. Inquisitor Varn stood still, tears streaking his face. He's gone, he whispered. Valen shook his head. No, he's here. They turned toward the open doors. Through the crack, The silver light poured into the sanctum, mingling with the first rays of the real sun. The chant outside had changed now, rising like a storm. We remember, we endure, we are his dream. Valen watched as the words echoed across the heavens. The Astronomicon flared one last time, bright enough to blind half the galaxy, before softening into steady, living light. No longer a god's beacon, but a species' promise. And somewhere beyond the veil, where faith and thought blur into the same thing, something vast smiled. The Imperium no longer remembered the Emperor as he was, but in their remembering, they had become what he had always wished them to be. Human. The throne was empty, the light endured, and in the hush that followed, the galaxy exhaled, for the first time in 10,000 years, in peace.